He was the most feared man in the drug world, a ghost to authorities. For over a decade, Nemesio El Mencho Oseguera Cervantes built an empire that spanned continents, controlling a cartel worth billions. With a $15 million bounty on his head, higher than even bin Laden's, El Mencho was the target of the most relentless manhunt in modern history. But on one fateful night, the tables turned. At 4:47 a.m., after months of surveillance and countless failed attempts, Mexican special forces surrounded his compound. For the first time in years, El Mencho was cornered. But he wasn't going down without a fight. The man who orchestrated ambushes, helicopter attacks, and terrorized entire regions of Mexico, now had no escape. What happened next would shake the foundations of the drug war, but it didn't just end with his death. It set off a chain of violence that threatened to tear the country apart. The world had its eyes on the final hours of El Mencho, but what they didn't know was that his death would ignite a far more dangerous battle for control of his empire. What happened in those last 24 hours? And who really won? You've seen the violence, the power, and the chaos El Mencho unleashed on the world. But the truth is, you're about to witness something even darker. You're not just watching for the story, you're watching to understand the cost of the empire he built. If you walk away now, you're turning your back on the consequences, the lives shattered, and the dangerous battle that still rages. Don't let this be another story you forget. Stay with us because this case isn't over, and the real story is only just beginning. Let's go back to his childhood. Born on July 17, 1966, in the small rural town of Aguililla, Michoacán, Mexico, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, better known as El Mencho, was a product of his environment. The town, nestled in the mountains, was marked by poverty. Mencho's father, a poor farmer, struggled to make ends meet, earning just a few pesos a day working the land. His mother, Eufemia Cervantes, did what she could to help by selling homemade tortillas in the local market. Their home, a modest two-room adobe structure, had no running water, no electricity, no luxuries, and no way out of the cycle of poverty that seemed to define the family's future. The oldest of 7 children, Mencho grew up watching his parents work tirelessly to provide the bare essentials for their family. His childhood was one of hardship, but from the start there was something different about him. While his siblings struggled to find hope, Mencho was driven by a dark ambition, a hunger for more that couldn't be satisfied by the life he was born into. By the age of 12, Mencho was already well known to the local authorities. Arrested multiple times for violent behavior, he showed no fear of confrontation. One of the most notable incidents came during a heated argument over a soccer game. Mencho, in his usual violent fashion, grabbed a broken bottle and stabbed another boy, an act that would haunt him and his community for years to come. His teachers would later describe him as intelligent but uncontrollable, a young boy with the intellect to go far but too wild to channel his energy in any productive direction. Mencho's early signs of aggression were not just confined to petty disputes. They were an indication of the violent path he was already carving for himself. Police records from the area would later reveal just how frequently he found himself in trouble, a constant disruption in a place where everyone else seemed to simply survive. At 17, Mencho made the decision that would mark the beginning of his migration into the darker corners of society. Like many young men in Mexico, he decided to cross the border into the United States in search of a better life. But Mencho's version of success was never about clean work or honest wages. No, his journey across the border would bring him into the world of crime. During the 1980s, Mencho ventured into California. He didn't come to seek fame, wealth, or a legitimate future. He came to survive, and his path would lead him deep into the criminal underworld. He worked in construction, restaurants, and farms, but it wasn't long before he turned to a more profitable venture: drug dealing. While the others worked honest, hard jobs, Mencho began to deal small quantities of heroin and cocaine, moving drugs in the shadows of San Francisco's Mission District. His low-level involvement in the drug trade was the beginning of his transformation from a small-time dealer to a ruthless cartel leader. In the gritty streets of California, Mencho learned the mechanics of drug trafficking from the ground up. He learned how to move product, how to avoid law enforcement, and how to make the most money possible, all while navigating the dangerous world of street-level drug operations. It was in these early years that Mencho's true potential began to emerge, but so did the violence that would come to define his entire criminal career. The story of El Mencho is not just a story of a man who sought power, it's the story of someone who from the beginning was destined to lead, but by a path filled with crime, bloodshed, and ruthless ambition. His early years weren't filled with dreams of wealth through hard work. They were years of learning how to survive in a violent world, years of discovering that power could be seized through control and fear. By the time he was deported from the United States in 1994, Mencho was no longer the scared young man who had crossed the border seeking opportunity. He had become a seasoned criminal, hardened by his experiences and eager to climb the ladder of power that could only lead to one thing: total domination. His journey into the heart of Mexico's cartel world was just beginning. But those who knew him, those who had crossed his path, knew that Mencho wasn't just another drug dealer. He was destined for something far more dangerous, and far more powerful. The path that would eventually lead Nemesio El Mencho Oseguera Cervantes to become one of the most feared and powerful cartel leaders in the world truly began during his time in California. After crossing the border from Mexico as a young man in the late 1980s, Mencho's life took a dark turn. At first, he worked various low-level jobs trying to blend in and survive in the United States. He labored in construction, kitchens, and farms, but the desire for more, something far greater than the meager life he had been born into, was never far from his mind. By 1992, Mencho had already become involved in the drug trade, peddling small amounts of heroin and cocaine. It wasn't long before law enforcement caught up with him. At just 26 years old, he was arrested for heroin distribution. This would be the turning point in his life. Rather than being deterred, prison became his training ground, a place where Mencho would absorb the very knowledge that would launch him into the upper echelons of the criminal world. Sentenced to 2 years at the notorious San Quentin State Prison, Mencho's time behind bars was not spent idly. The prison was a breeding ground for criminal connections that would prove invaluable for Mencho's future. Here he met and befriended high-ranking members of the Mexican Mafia, one of the most powerful and feared gangs in California. These men were far more than mere inmates. They were the architects of the drug trade, experts in money laundering, and skilled in cartel operations. And it was in San Quentin that Mencho learned the craft of running a criminal empire. He wasn't just a dealer anymore. He was absorbing the strategies that would shape his future: how to move large quantities of drugs, how to evade law enforcement, how to handle money laundering, and, most crucially, how to build a network of loyal and deadly allies. By the time Mencho was released in 1994, the young man who had entered the prison gates was no more. In his place stood a hardened criminal, a man with a vision of power and a deep understanding of cartel operations. His criminal education had been completed, and now it was time to put that knowledge to work. But his future would no longer lie in California. Mencho was deported back to Mexico, where he was about to take his first steps into the heart of the cartel world. Mencho did not return to his family's small farm in Michoacán, as many would have expected. Instead, he set his sights on Guadalajara, Jalisco, a bustling city known for its criminal activity and ties to Mexico's most notorious cartels. It was here, in the underbelly of Jalisco, that Mencho began working with the Millennial Cartel, a significant criminal organization involved in the trafficking of cocaine, marijuana, and other drugs. The Millennial Cartel was still finding its footing in the violent world of Mexican drug cartels, but Mencho saw an opportunity. His intelligence, ruthless ambition, and newly acquired skills made him the perfect candidate to help steer the organization to greater heights. It didn't take long for Mencho to rise through the ranks. By 1999, he was a trusted lieutenant in the Millennial Cartel, overseeing millions of dollars worth of drug shipments and expanding the organization's reach. He was no longer just a small-time dealer. He was playing in the big leagues now. His role involved managing key operations, coordinating shipments, and ensuring the smooth running of the cartel's finances. But it was more than just drug trafficking that Mencho excelled at. He had a gift for violence and intimidation which became his calling card. Despite his rapid ascent within the Millennial Cartel, Mencho knew that his ambitions went beyond just being another lieutenant in a cartel. He understood that in this world, power was everything. And Mencho wanted all of it. Over the next few years he began laying the groundwork for his own empire. While the Millennial Cartel was embroiled in internal power struggles and facing pressure from law enforcement, Mencho was quietly building his own network of trusted associates. He was recruiting soldiers, securing connections with Colombian suppliers, and learning the business of running an empire from the inside out. As the Millennial Cartel began to fracture in the early 2000s, Mencho saw his moment to strike. The government's crackdown on cartels was intensifying, and the organization was being weakened from within. But for Mencho, this wasn't a moment of fear, it was a moment of opportunity. He knew that the old guard was crumbling, and he was ready to step into the vacuum they left behind. It was during this time, as the Millennial Cartel's grip on power loosened, that Mencho made his most important decision. He would leave the cartel and form his own organization. He wasn't just thinking about surviving, he was thinking about ruling. And in that moment, the seeds of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel were planted, a cartel that would soon grow to become one of the most violent, powerful, and profitable criminal organizations in the world. But that story, the one that would cement Mencho's legacy, was just beginning. Mencho had learned everything he needed to know, and now he was ready to change the world of drug trafficking forever. By 2003, the landscape of Mexico's drug cartels was beginning to shift. The Mexican government, under intense pressure from the United States and its own citizens, had ramped up its efforts to combat the powerful criminal organizations that had long controlled the country's illicit trade. The Millennial Cartel, once a formidable player, was no exception. As law enforcement cracked down on the cartel, internal divisions weakened its structure, and Mencho could sense the coming collapse. He knew that the time had come to make his move. Mencho, ever the opportunist, began recruiting new allies, this time from the ranks of Mexico's elite forces. Former Special Forces soldiers, hardened by years of combat and skilled in military strategy, became the backbone of his operations. He didn't just rely on street-level thugs. Mencho was building an army. He knew that to take control of the drug trade in Mexico, he needed to think bigger, act faster, and use methods that others hadn't even considered. By 2010, Mencho's ambition had fully come to fruition. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel (CJNG) was born with Mencho at its helm. Unlike the other cartels, which had relied on traditional methods of violence and intimidation, CJNG would be a force to be reckoned with. A cartel built on military tactics and extreme brutality. Mencho's strategy was simple: be faster, be more brutal, and strike fear into the hearts of everyone who dared to stand in his way. CJNG didn't just operate like a cartel, it operated like a private military force ready to take on anyone, anywhere. The first major test for the CJNG came in 2010 when Mencho set his sights on the La Familia Michoacana cartel. The La Familia, once a powerful and violent organization, had been in decline for some time, but Mencho saw an opportunity to eliminate a rival and expand his reach. Using the military tactics he had learned over the years, Mencho's men launched a series of coordinated attacks on La Familia's cells. These weren't typical cartel skirmishes. These were precise, well-planned military-style assaults, complete with heavy artillery, tactical equipment, and well-trained soldiers. Within weeks, entire cells of La Familia were wiped out. The speed and efficiency of the attacks were a clear message. Mencho wasn't just another drug dealer, he was a force capable of toppling entire organizations. The success of this campaign marked a turning point for Mencho and CJNG. The La Familia cartel was nearly decimated, and Mencho's reputation as a ruthless and effective leader spread like wildfire. He had shown that he was not afraid to take on anyone, even the most established criminal organizations in Mexico. CJNG's victory over La Familia proved that Mencho had what it took to control the drug trade in Mexico, and his methods would set the stage for a new era of cartel warfare. From that point on, Mencho and CJNG would continue to expand their operations across Mexico. They would engage in increasingly violent confrontations with both rival cartels and government forces. But by 2010, Mencho had solidified his position as one of the most dangerous and powerful figures in the world of organized crime, and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel had become one of the most feared criminal organizations in Mexico's history. From 2010 to 2015, Mencho's reign of terror solidified his reputation as one of the most ruthless and powerful cartel leaders in Mexico. Under his leadership, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel (CJNG) rapidly expanded, transforming from a regional power into an international criminal empire. Mencho wasn't just a drug lord. He was a military strategist, a man who understood that in order to control an empire of violence and drugs, one needed not only muscle but precision and terror. The CJNG became infamous for its use of military-grade tactics. Mencho, ever the tactician, ensured that his cartel operated like a well-oiled machine. The CJNG's rise was fueled by its ability to strike quickly and decisively, using the element of surprise and overwhelming force. Between 2015 and 2017, the cartel carried out over 200 attacks on government forces, a staggering number that sent shockwaves through the Mexican government and law enforcement agencies. But the most shocking and brazen act came in May 2015, when Mencho's men used a rocket-propelled grenade to shoot down a Mexican military helicopter near Villa Purification, Jalisco. It was a direct assault on the Mexican government's ability to maintain control, and it marked a turning point in cartel warfare. Mencho's cartel wasn't just about drugs. He saw opportunities everywhere. While other cartels focused on traditional drug trade routes, CJNG expanded into fentanyl trafficking, methamphetamine, cocaine, and even human smuggling. The cartel's ability to diversify its criminal operations allowed it to operate on multiple fronts, creating streams of revenue that flowed into the cartel's coffers, making Mencho's empire one of the richest and most dangerous in the world. The CJNG's brutality knew no bounds. Mencho understood that controlling territory wasn't enough. He had to control the people. Through video threats and public intimidation, Mencho made it clear that there was no room for neutrality. His infamous statement, "We are everywhere. You can either work with us or die," was a chilling reminder of the power he wielded. By 2015, his influence was so pervasive that more than 50 police officers in Jalisco resigned in fear of the cartel's reach. Mencho's message was clear: there was no escaping his empire. Mencho's cartel had become a terror to Mexico, a shadow looming over both the government and rival cartels. His reign was built on violence, fear, and the strategic use of military tactics that left no room for resistance. In the span of just a few years, Mencho had gone from a low-level criminal to the undisputed leader of one of the world's most dangerous criminal organizations. On the afternoon of January 15, 2023, Mencho sat in the solitude of his private office at El Paraiso, a sprawling, fortified ranch just outside Guadalajara, a place he had spent millions to perfect. He wasn't a man who found comfort in peace, but at that moment, it seemed like the calm before the storm. It was 2 p.m. and he was counting stacks of $50 million in cash, the kind of money that could buy influence, silence, and power. Yet, for all the wealth he controlled, Mencho knew his empire was under constant threat. In that office, behind walls built to withstand the chaos outside, Mencho's mind was already at work. He had always been one step ahead, but today it felt like someone might finally be catching up. His thoughts were interrupted when his security chief, a man he trusted implicitly, brought urgent news. At 3:30 p.m., intelligence reports came in. Unusual military movements were detected near Talpa de Allende, not far from his second compound. Mencho's gut tightened. This wasn't a routine patrol. This was a full-scale military operation, and it was closing in on him. Despite the clear danger, Mencho made a fateful decision. Rather than fleeing with his family and subordinates, he chose to stay and fight. This was not a man who ran from his enemies. It was the same courage, or perhaps arrogance, that had brought him to the pinnacle of power. By 5:15 p.m., Mencho's convoy of 12 armored vehicles rolled out from El Paraiso. The convoy, a mobile fortress, was packed with his most loyal sicarios, armed to the teeth and ready to do whatever it took to defend their leader. They took back roads, carefully avoiding major highways to throw off any surveillance. As the convoy rumbled through the night, the weight of Mencho's decision bore down on him. The path to Talpa de Allende, a smaller, heavily fortified compound built specifically for moments like this, was not going to be an easy one. By 6:45 p.m. the convoy arrived at the compound. It was fortified like a military base, complete with sniper positions, underground tunnels and layers of heavy weaponry. Talpa de Allende was Mencho's last stand, the final bastion of his empire. The gates were slammed shut, and his men went to work fortifying their position. At 7:30 p.m. the worst possible news arrived. The final intelligence update confirmed what Mencho had feared. 500-plus military soldiers, including elite special forces, were surrounding the compound. Helicopters were already overhead, and armored vehicles were positioning themselves at every access point. This wasn't just another raid, it was an all-out assault. The Mexican government was sending everything they had to eliminate the threat that El Mencho posed. His security chief urged him to flee again, to escape while there was still time. But Mencho's pride wouldn't let him. He would face this head-on. At 8 p.m., with the air growing thick with tension, Mencho made a final call to his wife, Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, who was hiding in a safe house in Guadalajara. In just a few brief words, Mencho gave her his final instructions. "If something happens to me tonight, you know what to do," he said, his voice steady, though the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. "Take care of our children and keep the business running." His tone was matter-of-fact, as if this was just another day in the life of a cartel kingpin. But it wasn't. This was the end. By 9:30 p.m. the first shots were fired. The military had begun their assault, using helicopter gunships and armored vehicles to pound the compound's defenses. Inside, Mencho's men fought back fiercely, launching rocket-propelled grenades and deploying makeshift explosive devices. The compound erupted in flames as the battle intensified. For over 3 hours, gunfire, explosions and the whir of helicopters filled the air. Mencho's men, trained by former Special Forces operatives, held their ground, but it was clear that the military had more resources. The firefight was unlike anything the Mexican government had encountered before. This wasn't just a cartel fight, it was a war. The battle stretched into the early hours of the morning, the air thick with gunpowder, blood, and desperation. Mencho, ever the strategist, ordered his men to hold strong, but he knew the end was coming. The compound was surrounded, communications were failing, and their weapons were running low. By 12:30 a.m. Mencho's fate was sealed. The fight would soon be over. But he hadn't given up yet. Not without a fight. As the clock struck 12:30 a.m. on January 16, 2023, El Mencho's empire began to crumble. Government forces had already surrounded the Talpa de Allende compound, but now they began to take more aggressive steps to ensure that Mencho's reign would come to an end. They initiated a communications blackout, cutting off Mencho's ability to coordinate with his men, and then shut down the power to the compound. Darkness and silence filled the air, and Mencho was left in a vulnerable position, unable to communicate with his soldiers or receive real-time updates on the assault. His last line of defense was quickly crumbling, and with it, his hope of escaping. At 2 a.m. the final assault began. Military forces, equipped with night vision and thermal imaging, began a systematic push into the compound. The soldiers moved through the darkness like shadows, hunting down any remaining threats. They used advanced technology to track movements inside the compound, systematically taking out key defensive positions. The fight inside the compound was brutal, but Mencho's forces were starting to feel the weight of overwhelming military might. His men, though well-trained, could no longer hold their ground against the sheer force of the government's military power. At 3:30 a.m., Mencho made a fateful decision. With the compound being overrun and no way to communicate or reinforce his positions, he attempted to escape. He ordered his remaining men to gather in 3 armored vehicles, believing that he could break through the military perimeter and make a run for it. The convoy, packed with Mencho's most loyal sicarios, sped out of the compound and toward the nearest exit. But Mencho's luck had run out. The convoy had barely traveled 2 miles before it was intercepted by government forces, who had already positioned themselves along escape routes. There was no chance for Mencho to flee. By 4:47 a.m., the convoy had stopped dead on a dirt road just outside the town of Talpa de Allende. Surrounded by government forces, Mencho's men did what they had been trained to do: they fought to the end. Mencho, sitting in the front seat of the lead vehicle, grabbed his AK-47 and opened fire, launching the final shootout. For 8 minutes, bullets flew in all directions. Government forces responded with overwhelming firepower, using helicopters and armored vehicles to pin down Mencho's convoy. The firefight was intense, but it was clear that Mencho's time had come. His convoy was no match for the strength of the military's response. At 5:23 a.m., after a furious 8-minute battle, the Mexican military declared El Mencho dead. The world's most wanted criminal, a man who had built an empire on violence, drugs and fear, had been brought down in the very same way he had made his name, in a violent shootout. The cartel kingpin, who had once held a $15 million bounty on his head, was now a mere casualty of his own making. The empire he built through bloodshed had finally caught up with him. El Mencho, the man who had terrorized Mexico and defied authorities for over a decade, was gone. In the early hours of January 16, 2023, El Mencho's death was not just the end of a man, it marked the beginning of an even more chaotic and violent period for Mexico. The CJNG, which El Mencho had built into one of the most powerful and dangerous cartels in the world, responded swiftly to the loss of their leader. What followed was a series of brutal reprisals, a chaotic wave of violence that spread across the country. Within hours of Mencho's death, the cartel's operatives began to carry out coordinated attacks. Over 200 vehicles were set ablaze, blocking major highways and creating mass chaos. The road blockades were strategically placed across Jalisco, Guanajuato, and Michoacán, the very heart of the CJNG's operations. These violent acts paralyzed transportation, disrupted local economies, and caused widespread panic. The message was clear: the CJNG would not go quietly into the night. The death of their kingpin would not be taken without consequences. The National Guard, already stretched thin across the country, was hit hardest. In just the first 24 hours, 25 National Guard members were killed in ambushes and surprise attacks orchestrated by the cartel. The violence was ruthless and calculated, aimed at sending a message to the Mexican government. CJNG was not just a cartel, it was a private army, and it would stop at nothing to hold on to the power Mencho had worked so hard to build. But the violence didn't stop with the road blockades and ambushes. The CJNG initiated what was called Plan Apocalypse, a sweeping series of attacks that targeted government officials, police forces, and even rival cartels. The CJNG's reach was vast, and they knew exactly where to hit. Videos began to surface showing cartel members, masked and armed with military-grade weapons, threatening officials and anyone who dared interfere with their operations. There were reports of officers being assassinated, families being threatened, and entire neighborhoods being terrorized. The cartel made it clear: anyone who stood in their way would face swift retribution. As the violence unfolded, it became clear that the death of El Mencho had created a power vacuum, but also reignited the CJNG's ferocity. The cartel had fractured, but even in its fragmentation, it was deadly. Despite the loss of their leader, the CJNG showed it was capable of wreaking havoc, keeping the Mexican government on edge. Law enforcement and military forces scrambled to respond, but the country was gripped by fear, and the streets of Jalisco and surrounding areas became battlegrounds once again. The Plan Apocalypse was not just an immediate reaction, it was a statement. A declaration that the CJNG, even without El Mencho, was still a force to be reckoned with. Their leader may have fallen, but the empire he built, through fear, violence, and ruthless strategy, was still very much alive. And Mexico, caught in the wake of El Mencho's death, was left to face the consequences of this new terrifying chapter in its drug war. The death of El Mencho in January 2023 marked the end of an era for the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. Yet, far from bringing stability, his demise unleashed a power struggle within the cartel. The once unified organization began to fracture, and what followed was a bitter fight for control among his closest associates. His son Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, known as El Menchito, who was serving a sentence in the United States, attempted to take the reins. However, his incarceration proved to be a significant hurdle. Other top lieutenants, each vying for their own slice of power, launched their own campaigns for leadership. This infighting created a volatile environment, with different factions within the CJNG competing for dominance. The violence that followed was swift and brutal. In the first month alone, over 300 people were killed as rival factions clashed with each other and with government forces. Cities and towns once under the firm grip of El Mencho's cartel became battlegrounds as these smaller factions sought to claim territory and eliminate any competition. The once strong infrastructure of the CJNG began to splinter, and with it came unpredictable violence that plagued Mexico. Despite the fragmentation, CJNG's operations continued, albeit in a more decentralized manner. Smaller factions, while lacking the cohesive strength of their former leader, still wielded significant power. They expanded their influence not just across Mexico, but also internationally, trafficking drugs into the US, Canada, Europe, and beyond. Their reach was global, but so were the efforts of US and Mexican authorities to combat them. With the cartel now in disarray, intelligence and joint operations between the two countries intensified, focusing on dismantling the cartel's decentralized structure. The question remained, could CJNG survive its fragmentation, or would its legacy crumble under the weight of internal chaos? Only time would tell. The death of El Mencho in 2023 marked the end of a brutal chapter in Mexico's cartel war. His reign of terror, built on fear, violence, and a ruthless business model, is now a thing of the past. However, the consequences of his rise to power are far from over. El Mencho's CJNG may have fractured, but the power vacuum left by his death didn't result in peace, it led to more chaos. New leaders, emerging from the fragmented remains of CJNG, have risen to continue the cartel's operations. Though the structure is less unified, the violence has only increased. These smaller factions are less predictable and often more dangerous, operating independently and sparking battles not just with each other, but with rival cartels and government forces. Across Mexico, the impact of El Mencho's death is still felt. While his cartel's reign has been replaced by these decentralized factions, the drug war rages on. Mexico continues to grapple with the rise of new criminal organizations, each one learning from the mistakes of the past, and adapting to an environment where old power structures have collapsed. The end of the El Mencho era does not mean the end of cartel violence. It merely signifies the start of a new, more fragmented and unpredictable phase in Mexico's ongoing struggle with organized crime.